This happened a few years ago when I was maybe 15 to 16. I used to not have blinds or curtains on my windows, and I never bothered to get something to cover them up for a long time. My street is fairly rural, and we knew all our neighbors fairly well, so I was never worried about something weird happening until this night. It was sometime in winter. I've always been a night owl, so I was up late on my computer. I had the light on in my room, but it was pitch black outside, so I couldn't see anything out the window. It was completely silent in my house when I heard it. 3 loud bangs on my window. It scared me so bad I fell off of my bed and stayed down there for a while. Eventually, I convinced myself that it was some kind of animal, like a bat or something, that flew into my window. I calmed myself down and went back to whatever I was doing. I didn't really think much of it after that. I never bothered to mention it to anyone, until a few nights later around the same time. I had my window cracked open, still with no blinds covering it, when I heard leaves crunching outside like someone was walking on them. They stopped right outside my window, but it was still too dark for me to see what was out there. At this point, I probably should have screamed for my parents or called the police. I could feel someone staring directly at me, and I could feel they had bad intentions, but I was too scared to even move. Someone was out there. So I did the only thing I could think of. I stared directly into the pitch blackness outside of the window, put on the most intimidating face I could manage, and stayed like that. I must have sat in that position for 5 minutes until I heard the footsteps again, this time leading away from my window. I shut the window and tacked a blanket around it after I couldn't hear the footsteps anymore. I barely slept that night. The next day I bought a pair of blinds and told my mom about the incident when we were at the store. I heard footsteps outside my window last night. My mom doesn't get scared or intimidated easily. She's one of the most fearless people I know. But as soon as those words left my mouth, she turned white. "Did you tell your dad about that?" I told her no, I hadn't told my dad, and asked why she wanted to know. She looked me straight in the eyes and told me one of the most bone-chilling things I've ever heard. "Your dad was talking to our neighbor this morning. She told him that she had seen a man walking around our yard for the past few nights. Last night, she saw him walking towards your window, but he disappeared into the dark before she could figure out if it was one of us or not. She said after a few minutes he left, but he came back a few hours later and she saw him while getting ready for work. She knew it wasn't one of us this time, since the sun was coming up, and he had a knife in his hand. She went outside and screamed for him to leave, but instead of running down the street, he ran into our backyard and into the woods. I live in a military neighborhood. All of my neighbors are active duty, which tends to make me feel pretty safe if something were to happen. But after I had just heard that there was a creepy man outside my window more than once, and he ran into our backyard instead of down the street, I don't think any amount of military would make me feel safe after that. My parents never let me stay over at boyfriends' houses back then, but after that night, she let me stay at my boyfriend's house for almost a week. When I got back home, my blinds were installed, there was a curtain over the window, and the window lock that was previously broken was fixed. I haven't unlocked or opened that window since this happened. We never saw or heard about the guy again. My neighbor never saw anything again, and we reported the incident but never heard anything about it after that. I don't know who he is or what he looked like. I'm just glad he never came back. Before we move on to the next story, if you're still here, make sure to subscribe and comment where you're tuning in from for more true stories. Thanks. Winter used to be my favorite season. There's something really peaceful about snow, how it blankets everything, muffling all the noise. But working as a delivery driver in the winter, that's a whole other story. I'd been delivering part-time for a couple of years, and every winter reminded me why most people stayed off the roads during snowstorms. They're slippery, visibility is bad, and everything takes twice as long. But the silver lining? Most other drivers wouldn't want to bother, and tips were better. So, it was mid-December, and I thought I'd do a couple deliveries after my other shift ended. Just something to pad my wallet before calling it a night. The snow was already coming down pretty steadily, and it was dark by the time I got out there. The first few deliveries weren't bad. The roads were icy, but I was being careful and keeping it slow. After finishing a run, I was debating heading home when the snow really started piling up. I figured one more wouldn't hurt, but I was already getting second thoughts. On my way back to town, I saw something up ahead in the middle of the road. Hard to tell what it was at first, with the snow coming down so heavy. By the time I got close enough to see it, I couldn't stop. I swerved to avoid it, but my tires couldn't grip the ice, and the next thing I knew, my car slid off the road into a snowbank. The impact wasn't bad, I wasn't hurt or anything, but my car was stuck. I tried reversing out a few times, but my tires just spun in place. I realized pretty quick I wasn't going anywhere. I sat there for a second, frustrated, before grabbing my phone to call roadside assistance. The guy on the other end of the line said someone was close by and should be there in about 20 minutes. Not ideal, but what choice did I have? I gave him my location and leaned back to wait, keeping my car running so I wouldn't freeze. The snowfall kept coming down hard, and it was dead quiet outside. It was kind of eerie, just me and the empty road. A few minutes later, I saw headlights coming up behind me. I figured it must have been the tow truck, which was faster than I expected. The truck pulled up, its orange hazard lights flashing. A guy got out and walked toward me. He was bundled up, big coat, gloves, a scarf covering most of his face. When he got to my window, I cracked it open just a bit. "You stuck?" he asked, his voice slightly muffled by the scarf. "Yeah, called for roadside assistance a few minutes ago. Are you the guy they sent?" He nodded. "Yep, that's me. You're in pretty deep here. Let me take a look." He didn't wait for me to respond and just walked around to the back of my car. I watched him in the rearview mirror as he crouched down, seemingly checking things out. Then, out of nowhere, I saw him pop open my trunk. I felt a jolt of panic. I spun around and shouted, "Hey, what are you doing?" He shut the trunk quickly and walked back around to my window. "Just checking something," he said casually. I didn't know what to say. Why would he need to open my trunk? That didn't seem right, but I figured maybe he knew something I didn't. "Okay, here's the deal," he said after a moment. "I'm gonna need you to hand me your keys and step out of the car while I get things hooked up." Something about the way he said it put me on edge. I couldn't explain it, just a gut feeling that something was off. Let me just call the roadside number again real quick," I said, stalling. "Sure, no problem," he replied, but I could tell he was getting impatient. I pulled out my phone and called the number. When the operator answered, I tried to keep my voice steady. "Hey, just checking. How far away is the driver supposed to be?" "He should be about 10 minutes from you," the operator said. My heart dropped. Whoever this guy was, he wasn't with roadside assistance. I glanced up and saw him staring at me through the window. His posture had changed. Less friendly, more tense. "What's the holdup?" he asked, tapping on my window. "Just finishing this call," I said, trying not to let my voice shake. That's when I noticed movement in my side mirror. There was a second guy, coming from the truck parked behind me. He was holding something long. It might have been a tool, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. Before I could even think, another set of headlights lit up the road behind them, paired with a loud horn blast. Another truck pulled up, and this one I recognized as the real roadside assistance. The two men froze, then bolted back to their truck. They tore out of there, skidding on the snow, and disappeared down the road. The roadside driver got out and jogged up to my car, looking concerned. "You all right?" he asked. I nodded, though my hands were still shaking. "Those guys, were they with you?" "No," he said firmly. "We've been getting reports about this lately. People posing as roadside workers to target stranded drivers." I didn't even want to think about what could have happened if the real crew hadn't shown up. They pulled my car out, and I went straight home after that, still trying to calm my nerves. That was the last time I ever drove during a snowstorm. No amount of tips or extra pay is worth risking your life like that. There's a rule you learn pretty quickly if you spend any time out in the wilderness. If you come across a cabin or shelter during bad weather, you're free to use it. No questions asked, no judgments, just don't steal or mess anything up. Out there, survival takes priority. I was hiking in a remote part of Idaho when I learned just how important that rule can be. I've always loved being alone in nature. No noise, no distractions, just me and the outdoors. I'd planned a week-long trip, packed all my essentials, and double-checked the weather. The forecast had mentioned snow, but nothing serious, just light flurries, they said. The first few days went fine. The trail was quiet, and the air had that crisp, cold bite that makes you feel alive. Around the third day, though, the snow started picking up. At first, it was just a light dusting, nothing to worry about. But as the hours passed, the wind grew stronger, and the flakes got heavier. By mid-afternoon, the trail had disappeared under a thick layer of snow, and I couldn't tell where I was anymore. I pulled out my GPS, but it wasn't much help in the storm. Between the wind and the blowing snow, I could barely see a few feet in front of me. I tried to stay calm and keep moving, hoping I'd find some kind of landmark or clearing to set up camp. The storm only got worse. The wind howled, cutting through my clothes and making my face sting. Every step felt harder than the last, and I started to feel that creeping sense of panic. I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep going when I spotted something through the snow. At first, it looked like a shadow, a darker shape against the white. As I got closer, I realized it was a small cabin. It looked old and a little rundown, but it was shelter. That was all I cared about. The door was stiff, but I managed to shove it open. I stepped inside and slammed it shut behind me, cutting off the howling wind. The silence that followed felt almost overwhelming. The air inside was freezing, but at least it was out of the wind. I clicked on my flashlight and took a look around. The cabin was small and bare bones, just one room with a table, a chair, and an old wood stove in the corner. Everything was covered in a layer of dust and cobwebs hung in the corners. As I moved the flashlight around, I noticed something in the far corner. At first I thought it was just a pile of clothes or maybe some gear left behind by someone else, but then I realized it was a person. I froze, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The man was slumped against the wall, his head tilted to one side. His clothes were torn and dirty, and his skin was pale and waxy. He wasn't moving. It didn't take long to figure out he was dead. He looked like he'd been there for a long time, weeks, maybe even months. I felt a wave of unease, but what could I do? The storm was still raging outside, and I wasn't about to go back out there. I told myself it was fine. He was dead, and dead people don't hurt anyone. I set up my sleeping bag on the other side of the cabin, as far from the body as I could get. I tried not to look at him, but it felt like his presence filled the whole room. No matter where I focused my flashlight, I could feel him there in the corner. I told myself to relax. I'd been out in the wilderness enough to know how easy it is for your mind to mess with you when you're tired and stressed. The storm was loud, the cabin was cold, and I was probably just imagining things. Even so, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling and listening to the wind batter the walls. Every now and then I thought I heard something, a creak, a shuffle, but I told myself it was just the building settling or the wind outside. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because I woke up to a sound that made my stomach drop. It was a scraping noise, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. I sat up fast, grabbing my flashlight and shining it toward the corner. The body was gone. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I scanned the room, my hands trembling as I moved the beam of light around. The cabin was empty, at least I thought it was. Then I heard the sound again. It was coming from behind me, near the door. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get out, but the storm outside was still going strong. If I left, I'd be walking straight into a death trap. I forced myself to look over my shoulder, just enough to see the door. It was still closed. There was nothing there. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. I was exhausted, cold, and probably dehydrated. The wind outside was loud, and my mind was just playing tricks on me. But I couldn't ignore the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere inside the cabin. I snapped. I grabbed my pack, not even bothering to zip it up, and bolted for the door. The storm hit me like a wall, but I didn't care. I just ran, my feet sinking into the snow with every step. I didn't stop until I reached a cluster of trees where the wind wasn't as strong. My legs were shaking, and my breath came in short, panicked gasps. When I finally looked back, the cabin was gone. It was hidden by the storm, swallowed up by the swirling snow. I don't know how long I stayed there, huddled against the trees. The storm started to die down after a while, and the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. I made my way back to the trail, or at least what I thought was the trail. By some miracle, I found my campsite not long after. I packed up and headed back to town as fast as I could. I didn't tell anyone about the cabin or what happened there. Who would believe me? Even now, I can't explain it. Maybe I was just exhausted and imagining things. Maybe the storm messed with my senses. But I'll never forget that sound, the scraping, the footsteps. I haven't been back to that part of the woods since, and I don't plan to. If you have any scary stories, you can send them to the Gmail address shown on the screen.